offered freedom to slaves in Virginia if they would join the loyalists in Virginia against the rebels. We form a continental army under George Washington, and the decision is to invade Canada first, because we're hoping to get Quebec on our side, but it fails, and they don't join our side. So in 1776, the battle has now moved, some patriots and loyalists skirmishing in the south. Thomas Paine publishes Common Sense. This was a pivotal document, a pamphlet that took a lot of the major Enlightenment ideas of the time and translated it into common language and common ideas and addressed the situation at hand, that the colonies should seize this time to break away from Great Britain for a number of different reasons. It said that hereditary monarchy was a farce, and that basically this system of a small island rolling over a large continent was ridiculous, and like now is the time, it's perfect common sense to declare independence. Around this time you have the British decide they capture New York, and Washington's forces are forced to abandon New York, and they travel across New Jersey, and basically this kind of ragtag, half-beaten army is encamped on the Pennsylvania side of the Delaware. In December of that year, they make this desperate attempt to seize any type of victory, so they attack British forces at Trenton, and they rout a Hessian army. And so it was a minor victory, but it was enough to keep Washington's army together. The following year, Lord Howe invades up the Chesapeake, and he's going to march on and capture Philadelphia. Washington's forces meet him several times along the way, and they keep losing. They lose at Brandywine. They lose again at the Battle of Germantown. Howe's forces are able to capture Philadelphia. So the British are having no problems capturing the major cities, but they're not really capturing the countryside. And so Washington's new strategy is basically avoid being defeated by the British. And so that winter, he camps out in Valley Forge. His men are better trained, and ultimately come back stronger the following year. It's also when the Articles of Confederation are formed. So the Continental Congress basically forms this new government that's going to be a temporary government during the war, and each colony, or now states as they're calling themselves, has equal say. So they all have one vote. But they don't have the power of taxation. Every state wants to keep its own independent powers of taxation. So ultimately, the British try to invade the South. The Americans, after the Battle of Saratoga, are able to capture a critical alliance with France. And France starts sending over money, and then troops and ships. And ultimately, with the French support, and then later the Spanish, the British are finally able to be forced to a loss in the field. And basically, Cornwallis's forces are captured in Virginia at Yorktown. And this is 1783. This is officially kind of the end of, but that was 1781. The war officially is over by 1783. Treaty of Paris gives the American states, United States of America now, everything east of the Mississippi, except Florida, which goes back into British hands temporarily, and not anything above, not anything in Canada. That's still British Commonwealth. All right, so these independent states start creating their own constitutions, creating their own governments. They still see themselves as very independent of each other, though. So they all have to have their own constitutions. Some of them take those ideas that Jefferson had wrote in the Declaration of Independence and incorporate those. Jefferson and Madison also try to incorporate a bill for religious freedom in Virginia. Initially it fails. But these ideas are sort of the prototypes of the things that become the Bill of Rights. However, by 1786, it was clear that there were some major problems with the Articles of Confederation. A big problem, of course, was debt. The United States had borrowed a lot of money during the war, both from France, from the Dutch, as well as from wealthy Americans. And those Americans and those foreign nations weren't being repaid. And so individually, each state was paying off its own debt. And you still had debt owed by the Continental Congress as well. So you have debt issues that weren't being paid. You start to have problems within the states over collecting taxes to pay off the debt. So in Massachusetts, you have Daniel Shays, who was a former officer, leads a rebellion and basically against the Massachusetts legislature. It was put down, but it showed that these new states were pretty weak and they had a lot of problems and something needed to be done. So leaders decide to meet again in Philadelphia in 1787 to do some revisions to the Articles of Confederation. Well, as we know, James Madison, a protege of Jefferson's, in the meantime has decided that what's needed is a stronger national government. And so he enlists Washington's help, and they basically come up with a new plan called the Virginia Plan. And this is presented in the opening days of the Constitutional Convention. And very quickly they decide, hey, this isn't about rewording the Articles of Confederation or adding some things. They want to completely change it. And so he has a new idea, and it's not unicameral legislature, but bicameral legislature. Two houses, one representing the common people, one representing what you would say were maybe the aristocrats, the upper class. Also, a separation of branches of government. This is an Enlightenment idea taken from Montesquieu, and the idea that you would have a separate independent judiciary branch, an independent executive branch, and an independent legislative branch. Small states didn't like this. They're like, hey, this is taking too much power away from us. You know, we liked having everybody having one vote. Little Rhode Island could hold up everything. In fact, Rhode Island didn't even go to the Constitutional Convention. So the New Jersey Plan was proposed, which essentially was similar to the Articles of Confederation with some changes. Ultimately, they come with a compromise, the Great Compromise, or known as the Connecticut Compromise, proposed by Roger Sherman. And basically, the Connecticut Compromise, or the Great Compromise, was it would be a bicameral legislature, but the upper house, every state would have equal representation, not proportional based on population. The lower house would be based on population. The number of electors to choose the president would come from the number of the lower house and the upper house put together. And so that would give larger states more representation in presidential elections. And otherwise, they made some small tweaks, but that's the government that they came up with by September of 1787. And they're like, this sounds good. Let's send it back to the states, and they'll have separate ratification conventions to basically pass this. They didn't trust that if they went back to the state legislatures, they would pass it, because a lot of the states were giving a lot of power up to this new, stronger national government. So this big debate occurs over whether to ratify this new constitution. People that were in support of it, they fashioned themselves to be federalists. And this new term is coined federalism, and federalism is the balance between a national government and local state governments. So the sharing of power between the state governments and the central government is federalism. Madison, John Jay, Alexander Hamilton, they are very much in favor of this. They anonymously write newspaper articles in what are known as the Federalist Papers, published in New York and Virginia, arguing why this new system will work. Federalist number 10 takes on a criticism that you never had a republic in such a large area before. And Madison in Federalist number 10 argues that, well, it's better because having a large number of local factions will cancel each other out, and there will be no one faction that could dominate. And so the majority can't tyrannize the minority in a government like this. Anti-federalists, they're a little bit more varied. Some of them were small states people. Some of them were farmers that thought too much power was being given over to the wealthy people like bankers. Some thought that it didn't protect people's individual rights. There was no separate Bill of Rights like the British had after the Glorious Revolution. So Madison agrees to craft some new amendments, which eventually became the first 10 amendments, or the Bill of Rights, offering the freedoms that are protected for people from the central government. Freedom of speech, freedom of religion, freedom to bear arms. All of these different things were adopted. So ultimately, the states ratified, and this becomes the new law of the land. In 1788, they have their first election. Washington was obviously the clear choice, unanimously selected. Adams comes in second. He becomes vice president. That group ultimately becomes known as the Federalists. Now, Washington doesn't like the idea of political parties. And strangely enough, they didn't really think about political parties when they formed this government. But soon you have these dynamic differences between some members of Washington's administration and others. So the new Secretary of State, Thomas Jefferson, he often clashed with the Secretary of the Treasury, Hamilton, over their ideas for how powerful this new national government should be. So one of the big things was the formation of the National Bank. Basically, Hamilton thought that it was necessary for this new strong national government to take over the debt of the states and to slowly pay it back over time, and therefore incur a large national debt and continue borrowing. And so he would set up a bank that could lend out money and borrow money. And this idea would establish credit for the United States. Madison and Hamilton and Jefferson, they're not so crazy about this idea. They think that this is a new power that the national government was taking on that wasn't specified in the Constitution. So they argue a strict interpretation, whereas Hamilton offers a more loose interpretation. He says, well, if you look at Article 1, Section 8, it says that Congress shall be able to do anything that is necessary and proper to carry out the functions of Congress. And since one of the functions of Congress is to borrow money, then they could create a national bank. And ultimately, this wins over Congress and Washington, and they create a controversial national bank. Also, these groups start to split over which foreign country they're allied with. Hamilton and a lot of the Federalists like